hangs over Watts, like the smog hangs over Los Angeles. Harlem with palm trees is the way sociologist Alex Rosen of NYU describes it. But, he goes on, it really looks more like Tobacco Road. And most of the people I spoke with, the people who, unlike most of the city, have actually been to Watts and have seen the poverty, agree.
The structures may not appear to have the same dilapidated appearance as in other major cities, but the same conditions exist.
The area doesn't look like a slum. It doesn't look like the typical eastern slum, at least. It looks much better, and small houses, private dwellings, and it's not comparable to some of the slums that we see in the east. Yet they really are not that much different.
Instead of having them up and concentrated in a small area, we've got them spread all over Hell's Half Acre.
Hell's Half Acre, the words of Police Chief William Parker. And Watts is indeed Hell's Half Acre, a black ghetto locked in, ironically, by the freeways that speed traffic across the sprawling City of Angels. The crime rate is double the rest of the cities. Unemployment is high and still climbing, with 1 out of every 3 or 4 out of work. It's a land of broken homes and broken dreams. Yet each month 1,000 or more Negroes come up from the South, seeking the land of milk and honey. Few find it. And so this port of entry, this staging area, turns into a trap, a way station to nowhere, where hate and hopelessness fester.
The Negro middle class forgot about Watts. The white community hardly ever knew it existed.
We have at one end of the spectrum success and opportunities begging for people.
The whole conception of improvisation is a part of all of American life.
Prince Edward County, Virginia, the only county in America that closed its public schools rather than integrate them.
Here in Prince Edward County, there was this huge gap in what was being offered to white students versus what was being offered to the black students.
They were tar paper shacks, really the equivalent of chicken shacks. They were all heated by these big stoves in the middle of the classroom that would spew coal on kids from time to time. In 1951, a black high school student, Barbara Johns, thought that she and her fellow students deserved better. So she led a walkout to protest the conditions of the schools.
3/4 of the plaintiffs in Brown versus the Board of Education were students and families from Prince Edward County who were involved in the strike.
While the landmark Brown v. Board decision in 1954 made school segregation illegal, it was clear that some southern districts would resist.
The American Federation of Teachers passed a resolution basically saying the federal government should set aside funds to open up integrated schools. They knew that there would be certain counties throughout the South that would rather shut down their public schools than to integrate. And lo and behold, the next year, in Prince Edward County, Virginia, public schools were shut down.
The Board of Supervisors voted not to fund the schools. The schools were locked and chained.
They had a strategy where you could close the public schools, perpetuate segregation by running segregated academies, authorize that state funds be allocated in the form of vouchers.
In essence, the state was really supporting a separate private school district only for white kids.
I felt very sad because I've always loved school, and that was a very big part of my life.
The first year, oh man, we ain't got to go to school. Okay, you enjoy it, but all of a sudden something began to click. Something is not right. The white children, they're going to school. Why I'm not going?
Former black teachers set up makeshift schools in their houses or church basements, and some families made the difficult choice to send their children away for school.
I had never been at an overnight stay with anyone. The saddest part about it was that I had to leave my only brother behind, and that has bothered me for all of my life.
In the 80 to 90% of the black children in this county did not receive a formal education during those years that schools were closed.
Went back to the farm, sharecropping with my dad and so forth. They kept having hope that school would open next month, next year. So here's where you're going to school a little while, you're going in a little while, and that little while turned into 5 years. They ain't never had intended to open it up.
The American Federation of Teachers sent Richard Parrish down to Prince Edward County to investigate to see what was going on. And they came up with that idea of sending teachers during the summer to help children learn as quickly as possible to get ready for schools that might open someday.
The UFT sent 50 teachers with 16 students from Queens College to teach over 600 students in what they called freedom schools.
It was a single one-room schoolhouse, and we put in some tables and chairs, so it was a very informal situation.
Some of the students that had not been to school at all didn't know how to write their name or read or whatever.
They'd never held a book in their hand. One young man who didn't know what letters were about. If you saw this connection of lines, a word could come out, and it's a word that you used. I kept hearing from the kids, "There goes Fly," and I finally said, "Who's Fly?" And they said, "Him, he flies out the window when things aren't interesting." He was a good monitor for me to make sure that things were kept interesting.
It was a sacrifice for a lot of them to even be in this community, to be able to work with us, because it was teachers that were run off and scared off.
But many of them had a kind of warmth. I think it's significant to the kids to know that people from big places like New York City knew something about their plight.
These teachers were so loving, and I think they understood what we were going through.
The biggest thing it did, though, was to restore hope.
What's groundbreaking is this is the AFT's first community involvement on a larger scale that laid the groundwork for more community involvements for the AFT, and a number of its locals are in the 60s and 70s.
The program ended when schools opened for black students in the fall, but the Freedom School model was replicated the following year as part of Freedom Summer in Mississippi. Over 90 teachers from Detroit and New York City volunteered. The Detroit Federation of Teachers also ran a training academy for student volunteers, and AFT members helped develop the curriculum.
We hope to find and develop and mold local leadership among the young people.
The whole idea of how we're going to make this a better world for everyone really was the core of the curriculum, and it connected to dance, to music, to writing, to politics, to history. The white school board had systematically denied those options to the students, and part of what we were able to do was not only teach those courses, but talk to the students about why they had been denied those things. The whole idea of what we were doing was to establish a relationship with the students. That aspect, probably more than any other, influenced me as a teacher.
The children in their segregated schools had no art classes or materials, so they spent a lot of time there. I got a postcard from one of them. He said, "I'm still drawing and I'm going to keep drawing, Donna."
Just as AFT tried to right the wrong that was happening in Prince Edward County, our union has continually fought for civil rights. Our work with the Latino Hispanic community is a natural continuation of that.
The teachers in this country proudly support dignity and respect for all immigrants.
We've been focusing on the need for immigration reform, not just in advocating for a change in the law, but engaging with those communities, with our students, with their parents. And now I love that we have documented teachers among our ranks.
President Barack Obama announced the executive action which gave undocumented students deferred action and a work permit. And I began working at Rodriguez. This was my dream. I wanted to go back to a school where I could help students who came from the same community that I came from.
When I asked her, "Hey, are you going to be part of the union?" And she was like, "Yes." She's becoming this amazing union leader.
We do the DACA clinics, which we are trying to get more people that are legal residents to come out and fill out the application, and then getting those same people to vote to get policies that are going to support our schools. I'm very proud that I'm part of a union that is one of the pioneers.
We were here, your country, how came it yours? Before the Pilgrims landed, we were here.
presenting history's best on PBS.
They came from different lands, all facing an uncertain future. English and Ashanti, Mende and Portuguese, German and Igbo, Fanti and Spaniard, French and Angolan, some seeking adventure or riches or religious freedom. Others were captives, bartered and sold like cattle. Together they would build a nation and struggle over the very meaning of freedom and create the America we have inherited today.
I don't think you can understand race relations today without understanding slavery. Even though people will say, I didn't do it, my father didn't do it, even my grandparents, they didn't do it. One of the things that's essential is to know that slavery is not just a Southern institution, it's an American institution.
What evolves in North America is a belief system where to be black meant to be a slave, and to be a slave meant to be black.
We hold these truths to be self-evident. Why is it self-evident? It came from God. They're inalienable. Government secures them. Remarkable document. Didn't apply to black folks. And the man who wrote those words, Thomas Jefferson, kept slaves. He also wrote sometime later to a friend, if there is a just God, we're going to pay for this.
Slavery and freedom existed side by side in this country. I think the issue is, did it always have to be that way? And the early history of America indicates that it probably did not.
Your country, how came it yours? Before the Pilgrims landed, we were here. Your country, how came it yours? Before the Pilgrims landed, we were here.
Africans in America has been made possible by a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, expanding America's understanding of who we were, who we are, and who we will be.
They were torn from homes and families, yet they never let go of their courage and perseverance, and our nation is stronger because of it. That's why Africans in America is proudly brought to you by Bankers Trust, architects of value.
A home is more than four walls and a roof. It's safer streets, better schools, stronger communities. The American Dream. The Fannie Mae Foundation, helping Americans on the path to home ownership.
It's not just African American history, it's American history. McDonald's is proud to support this presentation of Africans in America. Additional funding is provided by the Ford Foundation, the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, Stratford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and the annual financial support of PBS viewers like you.
In the year 1645, in the colony that was called Virginia, in the county of Northampton, after a season of disputes, a white man and a black man went into the field and there divided their crop and their land. According to the testimony given in court, the man named Anthony the Negro said, "Mr. Taylor and I have divided our corn, and I am very glad of it, for now I know mine own ground." In America, it seemed, all men would be equal, all men would be free. In April 1607, 3 vessels carrying 105 colonists landed at a place they named Jamestown, at the edge of the Virginia wilderness. They hoped to establish the first permanent English settlement in the New World. There, Englishmen would build a new promised land, the brave new world that their poet Shakespeare dreamed. A free land built by free men.
The dreams were utopian initially. Colonies without coercion, without oppression, where each man would be regarded as free and equal. There was a lot of idealism, I think, in the early settlements in the New World. A lot of idealism, which I think didn't stand much to the test of experience.
Englishmen believed that their God had ordained them to spread his word, and that they had the God-given right to drive out all unwilling to live according to English law. But in the first 2 years, the colonists learned that they were unprepared for life in the American wilderness.
The 4th day of September died Thomas Jacob Sargent. The 5th day there died Benjamin Beast. Our men were destroyed with cruel diseases, of swellings, flixes, burning fevers, and by wars, and some departed suddenly. But for the most part, they died of mere famine. There were never Englishmen left in a foreign country in such misery as we were in this new discovered Virginia. George Percy.
In 1609, 500 settlers lived in the Jamestown colony. By the spring of 1610, only 60 were left alive.
About the latter end of August, a Dutch man of war arrived at Point Comfort. The commander's name, Captain Jope. He brought not anything but 20 and odd Negroes, which the governor bought in exchange for food. John Rolfe, Virginia colonist.
In 1619, a year before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock, a mystery ship appeared out of a violent storm off the Virginia coast. No one recorded the ship's name, but somewhere on the high seas, she had robbed a Spanish vessel of a cargo of Africans. In search of supplies, she traded the Africans for food. They had been baptized and given Christian names. As Christians, they could not be enslaved for life under English law. Like most Europeans in the colony, they were purchased to work as servants for a limited number of years. The new arrival supplied much-needed labor for the tobacco crop that was making men rich. Settlers were planting tobacco in the streets of Jamestown, carving plantations out of the surrounding wilderness, and shipping some 60,000 pounds a year back to England.
Once tobacco is established as a viable commodity, then the more land you control, the bigger profits you can make. And in order to make those profits, you need more labor, and you look for that labor wherever you can find it.
Well, the colony builders initially intended to rely almost exclusively on white indentured servants as a labor force to cultivate the crops that were being grown in Virginia, principally tobacco. And in order to create these raw materials or goods, you often needed labor.
Here's a health to the company and one to my lass.
The world the Africans entered was controlled by wealthy Englishmen and populated by the English poor, most under the age of 25. In return for passage to Virginia, they had traded 4 to 7 years of their labor. They were bound to a master by an indenture form, a contract that defined length of service and the conditions of servitude. Most were promised freedom dues after their service, a bushel of corn, a new suit of clothes, and 100 acres of land. Under Virginia's head right system, a planter was entitled to 50 acres of land for each servant brought into the colony.
The issue always was how long that indenture would be and under what conditions you would be forced to work. At its best, it was a short, friendly apprenticeship. At its worst, it was a long and exploitative situation in which you might die before you ever obtained your freedom.
By 1622, 3,000 new settlers drawn by the opportunities of the tobacco boom had arrived in Virginia. 2 years later, the first Negro child was born in the colony. He was named William Tucker, after a Virginia planter. The prosperity that began in 1619 and the dream of a new Eden, of people peacefully coexisting under English law, was seriously threatened in March 1622. On Good Friday, some 30 nations of the Powhatan Confederacy, angered by English violation of land treaties, attacked without warning and attempted to drive the English back into the sea. Along the James River, the Indians killed 350 colonists. On the Bennett plantation alone, 52 people died. Among the 12 who survived was a man named Antonio.
Here's an individual that arrives as one of the first African Americans in the history of what became the United States. He does what almost no one in early Virginia managed to do, and that is live. Everyone that's dying of disease, of violence, and in a sense he's lucky.
He had been brought to the colony the year before to work tobacco along the James River. His name appeared in the 1625 Virginia census as Antonio a Negro. He was listed as a servant.
He comes to Virginia, finds a society that is just developing. He's getting in on the ground floor, as it were. I don't know if he was able to immediately envision that there would be opportunities for him here that weren't available elsewhere. I don't know that anyone could have foretold that.
When Antonio arrived, the laws of Virginia did not as yet define racial slavery. They governed only the status of servants. At some point, Antonio changed his name to Anthony Johnson and married a Negro servant named Mary from a neighboring plantation. She bore him 4 children. By 1640, it is clear Anthony and Mary were no longer servants. They had acquired their own modest estate on Virginia's eastern shore.
As Johnson prospered, as he obtained land and cattle, he also acquired dependent laborers. What made all of this society go was property. Your identity in the society was determined rather obviously by the amount of land, the amount of labor that you owned.
Anthony Johnson was enjoying privileges belonging to a free Englishman. He claimed 5 workers as headwrights and expanded his property to 250 acres along the Pongateek Creek. At least some of his workers were white. By 1650, Anthony was one of 400 black people in Virginia out of a population of almost 19,000 settlers. In Northampton County, where Johnson lived, nearly 20 African men and women were free, and 13 owned their own homes.
As Anthony Johnson is accumulating property, it seems as though his situation is secure. You get a sense of this individual, this black man, being treated like any white planter, and his wife and daughters being treated like the wife of a planter.
At an early moment, when men and women were sorting themselves out, when the rules, the etiquette of race, labor, were not so clear. At this moment, in one county in Virginia, it was not foreordained that race relations would become what they did become.
In 1640, the year Anthony Johnson purchased his first piece of land, 3 servants had run away from a Virginia plantation and headed for Maryland. Captured and returned to their owner, they were tried for breaking their contract.
The said 3 servants shall receive the punishment of whipping and to have 30 stripes apiece. One called Victor, a Dutchman, the other a Scotchman called James Gregory, shall first serve out their times according to their indentures, and 1 whole year apiece after, and after that to serve the colony for 3 whole years apiece. The third, being a Negro named John Punch, shall serve his said master or his assigns for the time of his natural life. Jamestown Court Recorder.
The time of his natural life. According to all the legal records that survive, no white servant in America ever received such a sentence.
So what begins to happen in the 1640s is that those who are controlling the Virginia colony say to themselves, the fluidity that we've seen in the past, the fluidity that has allowed an Anthony Johnson to serve less than a life term, to acquire his own piece of ground, to develop a free status, is not something that we want to project as going further in the future. We want to close down that opportunity. We want to begin to show some distinctions.
The English definition of who could be enslaved began to shift from non-Christian to non-white. For Anthony and other Africans in America, the idea of an equal chance in the colonies was now under attack. In 1641, Massachusetts became the first colony on the British American mainland to recognize slavery as a legal institution. Connecticut followed in 1650, Maryland in 1663, New York and New Jersey in 1664. Virginia legally recognized slavery in 1661, and a year later, a Virginia court decided that all children born in the colony would be free or slave according to the condition of the mother. In Virginia, slavery would be defined by race and perpetuated through heredity.
Perhaps in the middle of the 17th century, if you were one of several thousand Africans living in Virginia, you certainly knew that your children would be free. You might have that expectation. And to suddenly find themselves involved in lifelong servitude, and then to realize that in fact their children might inherit the same status, that was a terrible blow. That was a terrible transformation.
I looked in the east, I looked in the west.
For the first 50 years of the colony, most of the unfree labor force had been European, But that was about to change. Word of the hard life in Virginia had gotten back to England, and the colonial government faced a growing shortage of servant labor. Also troubling the colony were the thousands of free men, most former indentured servants, who were unemployed and roaming the countryside.
About slavery and Horace to according.
The problem they face is not only a decreasing supply of indentured servants, but they face this increasing problem of what to do with all these indentured servants once they live out their term, and a lot of them were surviving. They had to be given land. They had to be given their freedom dues, and one of those dues included even guns, and there was a lot of unrest in Virginia.
In 1661, servants rebelled in York County. 2 years later, Gloucester County authorities foiled a plot by 9 servants to steal arms and ammunition and march on the seat of colonial government. In 1676, the unrest in Virginia exploded into civil war. An army of 500, free men, servants, and slaves, rebelled against the colonial establishment's restriction on available lands. They attacked peaceful Indians, ransacked property, and burned Jamestown, sending the governor into hiding.
This disorder that the indentured servant system had created made racial slavery to Southern slaveholders much more attractive, because what were black slaves now? Well, they were a permanent, dependent labor force who could be defined as a people set apart. They were racially set apart. They were outsiders. They were strangers. And in many ways, throughout the world, with a couple possible exceptions, slavery has taken root especially well when the people who are enslaved are defined as strangers, as outsiders, and can therefore be put into an inheritable, permanent status of slavery.
I understand there are some slave ships expected into York River now every day. I desire you to buy me 5 or 6 slaves, whereof 3 or 4 to be boys, a man and a woman. The boys from 8 to 17 or 18, the rest as young as you can procure them. William Fitzhugh, Virginia Planter, 1681.
Few ships coming from Africa made the voyage beyond the Caribbean to sell their cargoes on the mainland of British America. In 1672, the King of England chartered the Royal African Company, encouraging it to expand the British slave trade. Shareholders included 15 English lords and 25 sheriffs, the governor of Virginia, and John Locke, the philosopher of liberty. In its first 16 years, the company transported nearly 90,000 Africans to the Americas.
In the last decade of the 17th century, it was possible to imagine that in a single year, the number of new Africans arriving would equal the total black population in the colony, or close to it. These were men and women that had no sense of the world they were getting into, and they seemed to whites as very alien, foreign, unknowable.
The Europeans look upon these people and they project an image on them. They project an identity, and that identity is African. What that means is non-American. What that means is non-European. What that means is separation.
All servants imported and brought into this country who are not Christian in their native land shall be counted and be slaves. If any slave resists his master correcting such slave, and shall happen to be killed in such, it shall not be accounted felony. If any Negro shall absent himself from his master's service and lie hid and lurking, and if he shall resist any person employed to apprehend the said Negro, then it shall be lawful for such person to kill the said Negro. Virginia General Assembly, June 1680.
We think about slavery as this complete package. It just came to evil landowners, and it didn't happen that way. It happened one law at a time, one person at a time. And as landowners felt the need to control a different behavior, year after year, they added more laws until finally, 1691, they passed the law that made it illegal to free a black slave unless they were leaving the colony. So by then, it was pretty much set that this was going to be a slave society.
To move from indentured servitude to racial slavery means that they're setting their own history on a course where freedom is going to depend on slavery, where the political economy of a major portion of these colonies is going to depend on slavery, where the freedom of some is going to depend on the bondage of others. It means that the American colonies, this jewel of the British Empire, is living this contradictory history now of a society that is increasingly rooted in a labor system that's human bondage, that's racial slavery.
Anthony Johnson moved his family out of Virginia and north to Maryland. There he leased 300 acres he called Tony's Vineyard. On that farm, Anthony Johnson died. Back in Virginia, a jury decided that the land Anthony had left behind could be seized by the state because he was a Negro and by consequence, an alien.
One wonders how Johnson would have viewed this changing world of Virginia. He lived a very long time. He survived and did quite well by the standards of the day, building up properties, hundreds of acres, and cattle. By the standards of the time, anyone would say he did quite well. There's no reason to believe, as of, say, the 1670s, that the Johnson family is going to be squeezed out.
Within a few years, Anthony's grandson, John, purchased another 44 acres, and in memory of his grandfather's homeland, called the farm Angola.
By the time the end of the century came, Anthony Johnson's children and grandchildren may well have been fighting to stay free. Many free people were sold into slavery. You know, they couldn't prove that they were free. They had no way of letting anybody know that they were free. So if a plantation owner came by and said, "This is my slave and I want to sell him," you were sold.
By the end of the century, nearly 58,000 people lived in the colony. 16,000 were listed as Negroes. In 1705, the Virginia Assembly passed laws clearly defining the distinction between a slave and a servant, relegating all slaves to the status of real estate. The next year, John, the third generation of Johnsons in America, died without an heir. That would be the last mention of the plantation named for Anthony's birthplace. Angola Plantation, like the Johnsons themselves, disappeared from the record books of colonial America.
The African trade is a trade of the most advantage to this kingdom of any we derive, and as it were all profit, it is indeed the best traffic the kingdom hath. as it doth occasionally give so vast an employment to our people both by sea and land. John Carey, Bristol, England.
In 1698, the English Parliament ended the monopoly of the Royal African Company on the African slave trade. It became the right of every free-born British subject to trade in slaves. Over the next half-century, the number of Africans transported to the British colonies in British ships increased from 5,000 to 45,000 a year. England became the largest trafficker in slaves in the Western world. It is the first principle and foundation of all the rest, said one British writer, the mainspring of the machine which sets every wheel in motion. He was born Igbo, the son of a tribal elder, the favorite of his mother. He died an Englishman, the father of 2 daughters, and the husband of an English woman. At the age of 11, Olaudah Equiano was kidnapped by Africans and sold to Europeans.
Obonye ka anyị na-achọ, obonye ka anyị na-achọ, Equiano ka anyị na-achọ, nzumalizo. Obonye ka anyị na-achọ, obonye ka anyị na-achọ, Equiano ka anyị na-achọ, nzumalizo. Ojebe nkụ ya na-ata, ochube iyi ya na-ata, ojebe afịa ya na-ata, Equiano ka anyị na-achọ, nzumalizo.
When the grown people were gone far in the fields to labor, the children generally assembled together to play. And some of us often used to get up into a tree to look out for any assailant or kidnapper that might come upon us. One day, when only I and my sister were left to mind the house, 2 men and a woman got over our walls, and in a moment seized us both without giving us time to cry out or to make any resistance. They stopped our mouths and ran off with us. Olaudah Equiano.
Obonye ka anyị na-achọ, obonye ka anyị na-achọ, Equiano ka anyị na-achọ, nzumalizo. Obonye ka anyị na-achọ, obonye ka anyị na-achọ, Equiano ka anyị na-achọ, nzumalizo. Who are we looking for? Who are we looking for? It's Equiano we are looking for, nzumalizo. Has he gone to the stream? Let him come back. Has he gone to the market? Let him come back. Has he gone to the farm? Let him return. It's Equiano we are looking for, nzumalizo.
For more than 4 centuries, people disappeared from the savannas, the rainforests, and the villages of Black Africa. Farmers and craftspeople, commoners and African nobility. Most were strong young men, aged 15 to 25. But women and children were also taken and sold. To obtain slaves, Africans waged war, destroying communities, stealing people. To escape the spreading violence, many moved into the interior, abandoning family compounds, farms, entire villages. In West Africa, more than 20 million people were kidnapped into slavery. Only half would survive the journey to the coast. The boy Equiano was one of the survivors.
At last, I came to the banks of a large river. I was beyond measure surprised at this, as I had never before seen any water larger than a pond or rivulet. And my surprise was mingled with no small fear when I was put into one of these canoes and we began to paddle and move along the river.
On the journey to the coast, Equiano passed from one African master to another. Once he was sold for 172 cowrie shells. He learned 3 different languages, traveled some 800 miles, and encountered people and customs unfamiliar and frightening to him. After close to 7 months of travel on foot and by boat, he reached the African coast.
The first object that saluted my eyes when I arrived on the coast was the sea, and a slave ship which was then riding at anchor and waiting for its cargo. These filled me with astonishment that was soon converted into terror. O Lauda Equiano.
It was an ancient business, this trade in human beings between Africa and Europe. "50 years before Columbus sailed to the New World, Portuguese explorers had sailed to West Africa. At first seeking gold, they built a fort in 1482 and called it Elmina, the mine. The Portuguese pointed their guns toward the Atlantic to guard, not against Africans, but against European competitors. Over time, the castle changed hands from the Portuguese to the Dutch, and finally the British. And the trade changed from gold to human beings.
Concerning the trade on this coast, we notified Your Highness already that it has completely changed into a slave coast, and that nowadays the natives no longer occupy themselves with the search for gold, but rather make war on each other in order to furnish slaves. The Gold Coast has changed into a complete slave coast. Willem de la Palma, Director, Dutch West India Company.
Along the west coast of Africa, from Senegal in the north to the Cameroons in the south, the Europeans built some 60 forts and castles, warehouses for European merchandise and for African slaves. Called factories, they were commercial centers where agents or factors traded rum, cloth, and guns for human beings and gold.
The most notable item is the slave house, which lies below ground. It consists of vaulted cellars divided into several apartments which can easily hold 1,000 slaves. Captain John Barbeau, French slave trader.
In dungeons built deep into the ocean rock, people waited. Sometimes a day, sometimes a year. These chambers would be their last memory of Africa. When a slave ship arrived and anchored off the coast, they would be led out from the darkness to the beach.
As the slaves come down to feed her from the inland country, they are put into a booth or prison near the beach. When the Europeans are to receive them, they are brought out into a large plain where the surgeons examine every one of them, all stark naked. Each which have passed as good is marked on the breast with a red-hot iron imprinting the mark of the French, English, or Dutch companies. In this, particular care is taken that the women, as tenderest, be not burnt too hard. Captain John Barbeau, French slave trader.
The white people did not need to be present in the interior of Africa. All they needed to do was to supply the weapons. The people they dealt with were those coastal peoples right on the coastline who controlled the territory down there. So Equiano would not have met, maybe not even heard of white people.
I have found no place where I can enlarge my fortune so soon as where I now live. In this manner, we spend the prime of youth among Negroes, scraping the world for money, the universal god of mankind, until death overtakes us. Nicholas Owen, slave trader.
Europeans died like flies in that climate. The average expectation was 3 or 4 years, really. And so they had to make money while they could, because they knew they didn't have much time. So in that sense, of course, they were trapped. They were caught in the web of the system and held there and died there.
The Europeans made more than 54,000 voyages to trade in human beings. No one will ever know the exact number of people taken from the shores of West Africa, but more than 11 million have been counted in the records that remain. Most headed for South America and the Caribbean islands, some 500,000 to the mainland of North America.
December 29th, 1724. No trade today, though many traders came on board. They informed us that the people are gone to war with inland and will bring prisoners enough in 2 or 3 days, in hopes of which we stay. December 30th, 1724. No trade yet, but our traders came on board today and informed us the people had burnt 4 towns of their enemies, so that tomorrow we expect slaves. Liverpool Surgeon.
Received on this cargo 46 men, 34 women, 14 boys, 6 girls, and 147 chests of corn. The rest of the goods delivered onshore to Cape Coast and Accra to Mr. Harbin. William Dexter, ship's captain.
Ship captains were cautioned not to buy all their slaves from one place. Africans who knew each other, who spoke the same language, were more likely to conspire and rebel.
There would be maybe 25 seamen and the ship's officers. There might have been a crew of 30. And these 30 had to control maybe 300 men, black men and women, who were aware of being abducted and who were desperate and who were dangerous because they were obviously waiting to seize any opportunity that was offered to rebel and to take over the ship and to kill the crew, and that did happen fairly frequently. The only way that this could be contained was by a system of fear.
I was now persuaded that I had got into a world of bad spirits, and that they were going to kill me. their complexions too differing so much from ours, their long hair, and the language they spoke, which was very different from any I had ever heard, united to confirm me in this belief. I no longer doubted my fate. I asked if we were going to be eaten by those white men with horrible looks, red faces, and long hair. O lauda equiano.
Captains call the voyage from West Africa to the New World the Middle Passage, the middle leg of a triangular course that began and ended in Europe. From English ports, ships sailed to Africa to trade goods for slaves. Then the human cargo was taken to the Americas and traded for raw materials, which were then carried back to England and sold. The crossing from Africa to the Americas usually took 60 to 90 days, but some voyages took as long as 4 or even 6 months. Bad weather and sickness could turn any trip into a nightmare.
The cramped quarters of ships being packed in such a way that a slave will be between the legs of another slave and having to lie in the feces. The lack of air, the longer this trip takes, the more suffocating.
The surgeon, upon going between decks in the morning to examine the situation of the slaves, frequently finds several dead, and sometimes a dead and living Negro fastened by their irons together. When this is the case, they are brought upon the deck. The living Negro is disengaged and the dead one thrown overboard. Alexander Falconbridge, ship's surgeon.
There are no doubt people who went mad. Inability to communicate, decisions having to be made, and this person is suffering as yourself. Does one help? Does one simply try to make it the best that one can alone, not knowing where am I being taken? What is my fate? For weeks, months, depending what the point of origin was.
One day, 2 of my wearied countrymen who were chained together somehow made it through the nettings and jumped into the sea. Immediately, another quite dejected fellow also followed their example, and I believe many more would have very soon done the same if they had not been prevented by the ship's crew, who were instantly alarmed. O lauda equiano.
The idea, I think, was that the slave cannot be allowed to die by his own will and intention. He cannot be allowed to die voluntarily. If he's going to die, it must be at the hands of his captors, so that in that case he doesn't spread a dangerous example.
Monday, 11th December. By the favor of divine providence, made a timely discovery today that the slaves were forming a plot for insurrection. Surprised 2 of them attempting to get off their irons, and in their rooms found knives, stones, shot, etc., and a cold chisel. There appeared 8 principally concerned in protecting the mischief, and 4 boys in supplying them with the above instruments. Put the boys in irons, and slightly in the thumb screws to urge them to a full confession. Captain John Newton.
we stood in arms, firing on the revolted slaves, of whom we killed some and wounded many. And many of the most mutinous leapt overboard and drowned themselves in the ocean with much resolution. James Barbow, English sailor, 1701.
Often did I think many of the inhabitants of the deep much happier than myself. Every circumstance I met with served only to render my state more painful, and heighten my apprehensions and my opinion of the cruelty of whites. O laudo, Equiano.
The slavers, they knew at one level that these were human beings, because they were obviously clearly human beings. At the same time, they were objects of profit. And those two concepts couldn't obviously be really reconciled, and they never were reconciled. It was just, I think, that the humane, the sense of the humanity of these people, it was simply suppressed for the sake of gold. And the shocking thing is that human beings are able indefinitely to suppress the urgings of their common humanity and to deny it for the sake of making profits.
Is not the slave trade entirely a war with the heart of man? And surely that which is begun by breaking down the barriers of virtue involves in its continuance destruction to every principle and buries all sentiment in ruin. O lauda, Equiano.
The Middle Passage ended for Equiano on the island of Barbados, one of the most profitable colonies in the British Empire. On Barbados, it was calculated that it was cheaper to work slaves to death and replace them with new slaves than to treat them humanely. Within 3 years of arrival, 1 out of 3 slaves would die. The boy Equiano, judged too small to cut sugarcane, was shipped north to the mainland of British America. On the mainland, the plantation system of Barbados was admired and imitated, particularly on the Carolina coast.
South Carolina started as the colony of a colony. Barbados had become overpopulated with the younger sons of English merchants and with their slaves. And in both cases, they began to look around, cast around for new places. And within the first decade after South Carolina's initial settlement, there were just loads of immigrants from Barbados who brought with them slaves from Barbados, but more important than just bringing slaves, unlike Virginia, they brought a fully conceived idea of slavery.
On the shores of the Ashley River stands Middleton Place, home to one of Carolina's oldest families. Middleton family members were destined to become part of the Carolina elite. A governor, a congressman, a signer of the Declaration of Independence. The family had been among the first settlers arriving from Barbados in 1678, with a land grant in Goose Creek, just 14 miles north of Charleston, Carolina's slave trading center. By 1706, a second generation of Middletons had almost tripled the size of the family's land holdings to 5,000 acres of Carolina wilderness. At age 25, young Arthur Middleton was master of the Oaks Plantation.
Dear Sarah, Mr. Arthur Middleton is married to my sister and was a schoolfellow with me when I was at Carolina. He is a sensible man and one of the richest in the country, with upwards of 100 Negroes. Thomas Amory.
Racial slavery turns out to be extraordinarily profitable for the people who have seized control. The planter can complain in his diary that it's been a bad year, or the crop is weak, or the rainy season lasted too long, but year in and year out, tremendous profits are being made.
The immigrants from Barbados had searched for a cash crop that would make them rich. Families like the Middletons found it. It was rice. The most prized Africans in Carolina were from Angola, Senegambia, and the Windward Coast, people who brought the rice-growing skills the Europeans did not have.
Rice is the most unhealthy work in which the slaves were employed, and they sank under it in great numbers. The causes of this dreadful mortality are the constant moisture and heat of the atmosphere, together with the alternate floodings and drying of the fields, on which the Negroes are perpetually at work, often ankle-deep in mud, with their bare heads exposed to the fierce rays of the sun. Captain Basil Hall.
Many masters can't be persuaded that Negroes and Indians are otherwise than beasts, and use them like such. I daily perceive that many things are done here out of a worldly principle, little for God's sake. Francis Lejeune, Anglican minister.
In 1706, the Middletons donated 4 acres of land for a church in Goose Creek. Francis Lejeune, the first full-time Anglican minister, was not opposed to slavery, but he preached that all men, regardless of color, had immortal souls. He earned a reputation for spending time with the Negroes, baptizing and teaching them to read the Bible. He spoke out often against the brutality of Carolina slaveholders who were seeking to control the growing population of Africans.
I have had of late an opportunity to oppose with all my might a very unhumane law in relation to runaway Negroes. Such a Negro must be mutilated by amputation of testicles if it be a man, and an ear if a woman. I have openly declared against such a punishment, grounded upon the law of God. Francis Lejeune.
The Anglican missionaries probably described the black community better than anyone at the time in early Carolina. They described it as a nation within a nation. The Africans lived separated from the rest of society. Being freshly from Africa, their frame of reference was African. They were very much familiar with this kind of subtropical environment that they found themselves in Carolina. There's still communities of people who live, love, raise children, and work, and they feel that as people, as humans, they have a right to come and go. They have a right to visit their wives and their husbands on other plantations. It was, as one traveler said, a Negro country.
Their numbers increase every day, as well by birth as importation. And in case there should arise a man of desperate courage, exasperated by a desperate fortune, he might kindle a servile war. Such a man might be dreadfully mischievous before any opposition could be formed against him, and tinge our rivers as wide as they are with blood. William Byrd, Virginia planter.
In 1710, just 15 years after Rice took hold in Carolina, Africans began to outnumber Europeans in the colony. As the number of Africans rose, so too did white fear and retaliation.
Mr. D told me once he cut off a Negro man's leg for running away. I asked him if the man had died in the operation, and how he, as a Christian, could answer for the horrid act before God. And he told me answering was a thing of another world. What he thought and did were policy. He then said his scheme had the desired effect. It cured that man and some others of running away. O lauda equiano.
If you're a white authority, you're constantly trying to figure how tightly you want to impose the lid with respect to people running away. How fierce should the punishments be? Should it be a whipping? Should it be the loss of a finger or a hand or a foot? Should it be wearing shackles perpetually? The entire system of control is based on physical punishment, often making examples out of people so that others will be intimidated.
The colonial legislature passed laws designed to more tightly control the growing black majority. Planter records reveal punishments inflicted for infractions, large and small.
8th February 1709. I rose at 5 o'clock this morning and read a chapter in Hebrew and 200 verses in Homer's Odyssey. I ate milk for breakfast. I said my prayers. Jenny and Eugene were whipped. 17 April. Annika was whipped yesterday for stealing the rum and filling the bottle up with water. I said my prayers and I danced my dance. Eugene was whipped again for pissing in bed, and Jenny for concealing it. I took a walk about the plantation. Eugene was whipped for running away and had the bit put on him. I said my prayers. I had good health, good thoughts, and good humor. Thanks be to God Almighty. William Byrd, Virginia Planter.
When you enslave a person, in some ways, you become a slave yourself, because masters and slaves are natural enemies. And that's what the Europeans had to deal with. They had to deal with a population living amongst them, sometimes the majority of the population, in hostility. They lived amongst enemies. And as one Carolina planter said, nowhere on earth is mankind so plagued by enemies living within them as we are in our own homes.
The Spanish are receiving and harboring all our runaway Negroes. They have found out a new way of sending our own slaves against us to rob and plunder us. We are not only at a vast expense in guarding our southern frontiers, but the inhabitants are continually alarmed. Arthur Middleton, acting governor, 1728.
On the South Carolina frontier, word spread of Africans and Indians coming up from Spanish Florida to attack planters, and of Spanish authorities offering runaways freedom on Florida soil. In Goose Creek, an Anglican minister complained of secret poisonings and bloody insurrections by certain Christian slaves.
South Carolina is a pot ready to boil over. Imagine coming into a setup that seems almost unbearable and finding that people have many of them have somehow rationalized it or are enduring it. That's the best they can do. But you as a newcomer might feel, I'm not going to put up with this. Better to die trying to change this. And there must have been hundreds of people like that in South Carolina in the 1730s.
By the 1730s, close to 2,000 Africans were arriving at the port of Charleston each year. From 1735 to 1739, out of 11,000 slaves landed, more than 8,000 were listed as Angolans.
What develops is a sense among Europeans that slaves from certain areas have particular characteristics. Slaves from the Angola area are reputed among the English to be particularly difficult, to be rebellious.
In St. Paul's Parish, there were close to 1,000 new people who just a few years before had been taken from the Angola region of Africa.
One of them, we only know his name, a man named Jemmy, apparently had come recently from Angola. He may not even have spoken English, but he may have had strong contacts with other Angolans. He had to try to build alliances, not only with other Angolans, other new arrivals, but with other Africans, African Americans, people from a community that he was not that familiar with. And apparently he succeeded.
During the early morning hours of September 9th, 1739, almost as soon as word is received in South Carolina that England and Spain are at war, some 20 Angolan slaves, led by the man named Jimmy, began marching towards St. Augustine and the promise of freedom. Just 30 miles from the Middleton's Oaks plantation at the Stono Bridge, they seized a general store where there were arms and powder. They killed the storekeepers and left their heads on the doorstep.
What better moment to start an uprising and try to strike out for St. Augustine and find freedom in Florida in the hope that the Spanish authorities are willing to grant freedom to English-speaking slaves who escaped from the Carolinas into Florida.
On the march south, the Africans did not kill every white they encountered. They spared Mr. Wallace, an innkeeper they knew to be kind to his slaves. But before the day ended, they had killed more than 20 people. As other slaves joined them, they became an army of almost 100, camped at the Edisto River, waiting for others to gather under their flag.
The entire force of English North America was going to come down on them, because this was an issue not merely for those in South Carolina immediately surrounding this area. This was an issue for every European colonist everywhere in the colonies to quash this and to provide some exemplary punishment.
Around noon, the nearest white settlers were alerted. By 4 in the afternoon, they caught up with the Negroes along the Edisto River and fired upon them. Eyewitnesses recorded that the rebels fought boldly, but at least 14 were killed or wounded in the first attack. Others were surrounded, questioned, and then shot. The armed colonists then turned toward Charleston, and on milepost along the way, they left the heads of the executed men.
Just the way war transforms people, this terrible transformation into race slavery had changed people by the middle of the 18th century. So the violence you see at Stono is a violence that had become pervasive in the culture. By the middle of the 18th century, this had become a way of life in the English colonies.
Stono was sort of the beginning of the concept that the black population had to be utterly controlled. And the legislation that came out of Stono, the Negro Act, took away whatever liberties the Africans had.
Freedom of movement, freedom of assembly, to earn money, to learn to read, all were outlawed. South Carolina imposed duties on all slave importations and encouraged European immigration in order to change the ratio of whites to blacks. The Negro Act became the model for slave laws throughout the mainland of British America.
Why do you use those instruments of torture? Are they not fit to be applied by one rational being to another? And are ye not struck with shame and mortification to see the partakers of your nature reduced so low? But above all, are there no dangers attending this mode of treatment? Are you not hourly in dread of an insurrection? O lauda equiano.
News of the rebellion traveled quickly to New York, now the third largest city in British America. Most of Manhattan Island was unbroken wilderness, crossed by streams emptying into both the Hudson and East Rivers. By 1740, except for Charleston, South Carolina, no city in colonial America had so high a density of slave population as New York. Crowded onto the southern tip of the island lived 11,000 people, of which more than 2,000 were black.
There was really an illusion of intimacy between enslaved blacks and their white slave owners who lived under the same roof. These people could not trust one another. In fact, the slave owners considered the enslaved blacks domestic enemies.
New York, November 18th, 1731. Be it ordained by the authority of this city that all Negro, mulatto, and Indian slaves that shall die within this city be buried by daylight. And for the prevention of great numbers of slaves assembling and meeting together at their funerals, under pretext whereof they have great opportunities of plotting and confederating together to do mischief, be it further ordained that not above 12 slaves shall assemble or meet together at the funeral. Minutes of the Common Council of New York.
There were probably a lot of other issues going on in New York City at that time that made whites suspicious of blacks. There was, among the lower classes of blacks and whites, a lot of racial amalgamation. There was a lot of activity in the grog shops between blacks and whites, blacks frequenting taverns. New York City was a cosmopolitan place, with people from various ethnic groups converging, lots of seamen, and blacks were very much a part of that.
In taverns, black men illegally gathered, drank, and mingled with white New York residents. Many enslaved men in New York were hired out by their masters. They had relative freedom of movement and control over their own time.
The African-American adult male is seen as the most troublesome, the most intractable, the most rebellious. Those are the persons who are growing in the population. By law, they're not supposed to be out after sunset. By law, they're not supposed to have any currency of their own. By law, they're not supposed to go and gather in numbers of 3 or greater. By law, they're not supposed to be out drinking, yet every night they're out doing all of these things.
There developed in colonial New York City a lively street life amongst black men, and enslaved and free. These black men organized into clubs or gangs, and they were a constant presence on the streets. They even gathered at nights at the docks or in taverns, and they presented, according to the English authorities and anxious white residents, a public threat.
On March 18, 1741, a fire broke out at Fort George, the governor's official residence. Whipped by violent winds, it burned until a rain shower cooled the blaze, keeping it from torching the entire city. A week later, another fire broke out, and then in the next 3 weeks, fires raged.
As this rash occurs, a sense that there is some evil hand behind this develops. And then people begin to see a black hand. They begin to worry that slaves are behind this, that this is some act of vengeance, that this is some prelude to rebellion.
In 1741, England was now at war with Spain, and many of the colonial authorities in New York City feared that the enslaved blacks would have been influenced by the promises from Spain of freedom. It was the English authorities who claimed that they had discovered a combination between enslaved blacks and the lower orders of white town dwellers, transients, and vagabonds to destroy the town, to burn it to the ground, and to set up a black or Negro regime that would owe allegiance to Spain.
Just 30 years earlier in New York, fire had been instrumental in the Negro plot of 1712, where 9 whites were killed and 5 were seriously wounded. Now, the city's officials did not waste any time finding an explanation for the mysterious events.
A general dragnet goes out, and just about every African-American male over 16 years of age is taken up and put in jail, crowded under the city hall.
The court used the testimony of Mary Burton, a 16-year-old indentured servant, to accuse the alleged conspirators. Burton worked at a tavern and brothel in the city, a business that regularly served black customers. Promised her freedom from servitude, Mary Burton started implicating a constant stream of men and women, some white, but most young black men. For close to 4 months, black men were dragged into court off New York streets.
New Yorkers are so incensed over what they conceive of as a conspiracy that they create this wave of paranoia that leads to incredible murders and incredible punishments. It speaks to the whole entrenchment of slavery, even in the North, and also it speaks to racial attitudes as well, that they are very much afraid of racial egalitarianism and people in the lower echelons of their society coming together to form any kind of bond.
In May, New Yorkers witnessed the public execution of Caesar and Prince, 2 black men accused of participating in a robbery connected to the fires. Caesar's corpse was then hung in chains until it decomposed. From the spring of 1741 through the following winter and into the spring of 1742, some 160 slaves and at least a dozen whites were accused of conspiracy against the city of New York. 31 Africans were put to death, 13 of them burned at the stake, and 4 whites were hung.
June 1741. To Dr. Cadwallader de Colden, Governor's Council, Province of New York. Sir, the horrible executions among you puts me in mind of our New England witchcraft in the year 1692. I am humbly of the opinion that such confessions are not worth a straw, for many times they are obtained by foul means, by force or torment, or in hopes of a longer time to live, or to die an easier death. I entreat you not to go on making bonfires of the Negroes and loading yourselves with greater guilt than theirs. For we have too much reason to fear that the divine vengeance does and will pursue us for our ill treatment to the bodies and souls of our poor slaves. Anonymous letter from Massachusetts.
The encroachment of slavery in American society that began in Virginia culminated in 1750 with the decision to legalize slavery in Georgia, the last free colony. It had been a little over 100 years since Anthony Johnson first arrived in Virginia. Now slavery existed everywhere in the 13 colonies. But the argument over who would be free and who would be equal had just begun. For generations to come, slavery would continue to trouble the soul of America.
When you make men slaves, you deprive them of half their virtue. You set them, in your own conduct, an example of fraud and cruelty, and compel them to live with you in a state of war. Olaudah Equiano, enslaved African.
Your country, how came it yours? Before the Pilgrims landed, we were here.
To learn more about Africans in America and to see the Teacher's Guide for the series, visit the Africans in America website at www.pbs.org. Next time on Africans in America. America's struggle for independence begins. With the threat of war, black men become soldiers in exchange for the promise of freedom.
It gave you a purpose in life. You were part of a national effort.
To purchase the Africans in America home video, companion book, or CD soundtrack, call 1-800-255-9424.
Like you makes this program possible. Please give to your PBS station.
When the Civil War began in 1861, nearly 4 million black people were trapped in bondage for life.
After the war was over and slavery abolished, Reconstruction was well underway. And although there were challenges ahead, black people were filled with an unprecedented amount of hope.
Frederick Douglass felt triumphant. The black man, he declared, is a citizen. The black man is enfranchised. We live in a new world. At last, he said, the black man has a future.
The 15th Amendment to the Constitution barred racial discrimination in voting. Black men took to the polls.
Then you see all of these black people in charge. More than 1,500 black officials move into positions of public leadership.
If you were an African American who had just been elected to the legislature, it was your time. The future must have seemed limitless.
Robert Smalls of South Carolina was one of these legislators. He had escaped slavery by boldly commandeering a Confederate ship and delivering it to the United States Navy, blockading Charleston Harbor. After the war, Smalls returned home to Beaufort and became one of the first heroes of Reconstruction. Michael, tell me about your great-great-grandfather's life.
You know, society told Robert that he was less than a human being, that he was a piece of chattel, that he was devoid of higher-level thinking and strategy and planning. But he rejected all of that. The way that he commandeered the boat that was the vehicle of his freedom, in the middle of the night, putting on the top hat and the long coat of the Confederate captain. I just admire the audacity he had to steal his freedom, to seize his freedom. He was born in a shack behind the house. He was enslaved here. After the war, he comes back and he owns the place.
From being property to owning the property.
Absolutely.
He went from being enslaved to being elected as state legislator in 6 years.
He was elected to the South Carolina House and then the South Carolina Senate before going to Washington and Congress.
That is the most remarkable up from slavery story I ever heard. Once he was in office, what sort of issues were important to him?
You know, he grew up with the children of his master and would see them going to school, and it just bothered him. He thirsted for education and sought through legislation to extend that to others.
Were you insufferable among your friends when you were in school? Would you say, my great-great-grandfather was famous?
No, actually quite the contrary. I grew up in the 70s in Boston. Race was a touchy issue then with busing. In April of 1976, I was 13. I had an opportunity to unveil the bust of Robert Smalls that's here in Beaufort. That was the first time I spoke about Robert Smalls, and I've done it hundreds and hundreds of times since. Look, this is American history. Robert's story is a metaphor for this broader movement that empowered a whole race of people.
Reconstruction is a story of great expectations, enormous strides, and wrenching retreats. Early on, in its most hopeful moments, it seemed like a revolution was taking place in the halls of Congress. Tell me about where we're standing. What would this place have been like during Reconstruction?
So this is the old hall, the House, now Statuary Hall. In the 1870s, when the African-American members were here, there would have been vendors in here selling food and snacks. As members traversed the north-south access from the House chamber over to the rotunda on the Senate side.
Tell me about the first black congressman.
First is Hiram Revels from Mississippi. He's elected to the U.S. Senate, and he comes in February of 1870, and he's celebrated as the 15th Amendment in flesh and blood, the symbolic triumph of Reconstruction. And then in December, we have Joseph Rainey of South Carolina, first African-American in the House.
How would they have been greeted?
They didn't exactly roll out the red carpet, but the door didn't get shut either. Many of the African-American members lived in the same neighborhoods that white members of Congress did. So they weren't segregated in that sense, but they oftentimes had to pay higher rents.
It's a black tax.
Essentially, yes. Imagine you have these two men who occupy the seats of former slaveholders, and they come to work in this magnificent Temple of Liberty, but it's a place that had also been constructed with slave labor. This is an incredibly heady moment, kind of like Barack Obama becoming president. There's like 14 black men in U.S. Congress. There's 2 senators. Blanche K. Bruce's name is on money. He's signing currency in the United States.
See, all of these people served starting in the 1870s. I may be the only African-American from South Carolina now, but I am the 9th. You had the Robert Smalls, Richard Keynes, Robert Elliott, DeLarge, Rancia. So over that period of 25 years, you had real participatory democracy taking place.
The photograph of Hiram Revels highlights this statesman who happens to be African-American. Frederick Douglass recognized a camera captured the equal and essential humanity of that man or woman, black or white.
Whatever may be the prejudices of those who look upon it, they will be compelled to admit that the Mississippi senator is a man.
He is represented with the same stature as Lincoln or Seward or Grant or any other white politician. Douglass did the same thing. at a time in which most whites tried to argue that blacks should not have equal citizenship. And one way of out-citizening white citizens is you portray yourself with greater sense of dignity and respectability, and in a sense humanity, than many whites.
We do not come here begging for our rights. We come here clothed in the garb of American citizenship. We come demanding our rights in the name of justice.
Richard Kane could capture an audience. I think all his years in the pulpit made him a really good speaker in the House. He stood up to the white supremacists who were basically calling him, inferior. And he said, look at me, I have 2 eyes, I have 2 ears, I have 2 hands, I have 2 feet. How are we different when it comes to our manhood?
I was amazed when I began to read the speeches of black congressmen in that period. I mean, here are people who are arguing about what the laws of the nation will provide in terms of human rights, and have a sophisticated understanding of the underlying principles that make these freedoms necessary in a democratic society. The level of discourse was so far above the level of discourse in Congress today. It was shocking.
In state houses across the South, black men and white men were attempting to govern together for the first time. In South Carolina, where African Americans made up almost 60% of the population, voters elected a black majority House of Representatives.
It was the seat of Black Power USA. The Lieutenant Governor, Secretary of State, State Treasurer.
Unimaginable today.
Absolutely.
Many parts of the South didn't have a educated and experienced black leadership ready to step into power, which you did have in South Carolina. It had a free black group before the Civil War in Charleston, which was well-educated and politically articulate.
Behind us lie 243 years of suffering, anguish, and degradation. Before us lies our mighty future. That future is ours to shape.
Robert Brown Elliott was very ambitious. He was educated as a lawyer. He had a photographic memory. He was absolutely fearless.
It's hard to imagine more daunting challenges than all these governments have. Some parts of the South had really been devastated by war. So you've got to try to build a forward-looking government at a time where there are very few resources.
The state legislatures create public schools, public hospitals, public welfare systems in a way that hadn't been seen in the South.
Black men go into these legislatures with an idea of how they're going to improve their communities. One of the most important things they do is to establish free public schools.
There were no public education systems in most of the southern states. If you had money to buy it for your children, you had it. If you didn't, well, you did without. You start to see state constitutions adopting some policy that says education is a right. And this is providing it for all children.
Across the former Confederacy, free schools opened for both black and white children. Only a few years earlier, there were laws on the books in the South that prohibited enslaved people from learning to read and write.
Black people knew how much their freedom depended upon literacy. It was not uncommon to see 5-year-olds and 95-year-olds flocking to schoolhouses for a chance to learn how to read.
Free blacks realized white families are not going to send their kids to school with blacks. And so in every single state, you had separate schools. And black leaders generally said, that's okay. As long as black people get education, we're not going to try to force whites to go to school where they don't want to. And many black parents wanted black teachers. They didn't trust white teachers to be fair and to have the right attitudes to their children.
To meet this demand for teachers, governments, black churches, and missionary organizations established black colleges and universities. Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee was founded in 1866.
Let my people
into this phrase.
Go down,
Where?
way down in Egypt's land.
The Fisk Jubilee Singers became the voice of Black Reconstruction. They introduced the world to the artistry of freed people and to the songs of their enslaved ancestors, the spirituals.
Most white people who had ever seen blacks on stage had done so in the minstrel show.
Minstrels, white men who would paint their faces black, enlarge their lips with white makeup, and spoof the African American. America found this entertaining.
But in concert after concert, first in Northern American cities and then in Europe, the singers defied expectations.
They had a decorum and a dignity on stage that challenged all of the prevailing stereotypical images that white Americans had.
These are songs of overcoming. They were about healing. They were about love. They were about the Black struggle.
They allowed someone else to understand what it means to be in your world or in your shoes.
Coming forth to carry me home.
Using profits from performances, Fisk was able to buy the land on which it sits today. Fisk is one of the many historically Black colleges and universities established during Reconstruction that are still educating students. Black people were also beginning to make inroads into other spheres of American life. They were buying land, setting up businesses, and becoming economically independent.
I started a farm.
I own one lot, 7 acres, another 1 acre, and another about 1/4 of an acre. I bought myself a little plantation. I bought another place, and together, that makes 98 acres.
I bought 150 acres. I have about 50 or 60 acres tended.
I rented 43 acres of land. I have a good crop in.
My husband put up an elegant blacksmith shop.
I have a son I sent to school.
It's a moment of possibility. They have reunited their families, they have formalized their unions, they have property, they have their own businesses.
The 14th Amendment had granted equal citizenship to all Americans, especially African Americans.
It was about being able to claim an American birthright, full citizenship. They saw themselves as really moving forward.
What does real equality look like? It looks like equal protection under the law.
Now African Americans could serve as sheriffs. So they were able to go out and make arrests and bring white perpetrators in for justice.
Black people get to be judges. They get to sit on juries. They get to sign contracts in their own interest.
John Roy Lynch, a successful young businessman in Natchez, Mississippi, was appointed in 1869 as a justice of the peace.
He was born a slave in 1847 in Louisiana, the son of the plantation manager. And at the end of the Civil War, he attended night school.
As a very young man, he distinguished himself working in a photographer's studio.
He went to a few Republican meetings
and impressed Adelbert Ames, who was the Reconstruction governor of Mississippi. Even though Lynch was only 21 years old, Ames appointed him to be a magistrate.
In his memoir, he wrote about how former slaves would bring all their problems to him as a local justice of the peace. There was a black man in this office. There had never been such a thing in Mississippi before the Civil War, and so former slaves kind of identified with him.
A case that came before me was that of a white man. He threatened the life of an old colored man over a business transaction. He remarked, "Do you mean that it's a crime for a white man to curse a nigger?" "Yes," the court replied. "It is as much a crime for a white man to curse a Negro as it is for a Negro to curse a white man." "Well," he exclaimed, "that's news to me."
You're living in this moment. You're imagining that will only get better.
In slavery, African Americans could not control their communities. And so if people are drawing on the resources that they had developed in slavery, on their sense of what it meant to have family relationships, friendships, communities, and they're able to institutionalize them in new ways.
They create fraternal organizations like the Masons that find solidarity and strength in mutual support.
He was born free in what's now West Virginia. Was a pastor of Brooklyn in 1965. Some people would have said, stay in Brooklyn where it's safe.
He said that he felt like a lion bound. I mean, he wanted to be here in the South and be a missionary to the newly freed slaves.
I don't think people today understand the role of the church in the 19th century. The church was their institutional universe.
Yes, the Black church was the center of everything that happened with the community. The emotional, the educational, the political taught the newly freed slaves that they were no longer inferior. They could accomplish anything.
And he epitomized that.
Yeah.
He was a one-man band for the Black community.
Oh, yeah.
Entrepreneur, minister, editor, writer.
Yes, congressman, state senator.
Too powerful, too influential.
Yes, yes.
And therefore a danger.
Yes, he lived in constant fear.
One of the most tragic aspects of Reconstruction is that the more African Americans achieve, the more they put their lives at risk.
I could hear the noise of the horses.
They Ku Klux my house.
They had on white gowns, masks on their faces.
75 men.
They were Ku Klux.
They tore her clothes off.
I was blindfolded. Cut me with knives.
They whipped me.
They
whipped me.
Put a rope around my neck to hang me.
Southern Democrats used violence and terror tactics to disrupt Republican control and plot their return to power. They saw themselves as the redeemers of their states.
Violence is efficient, it's easy, it's fast, and you can often do it under the cover of night. Klan attacks become so pervasive because that's how widespread the fear of Black enfranchisement is.
The Klan is actually committing atrocities against everyone. They're attacking freedmen and white Southerners who were sympathetic to the Union cause and to the Republican Party.
To their eyes, emancipation was wrong. They are washing the South with blood to redeem it.
This isn't simply a question of trying to return to an earlier way of life. This is actually a political counter-revolution.
To document the violence, Congress in 1871 launched one of the most extensive investigations in our history, known as the Ku Klux Klan hearings. The United States never had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission after slavery ended. The Klan hearings were as close as we came. It was extraordinary. Congress was actually listening to Black people, testifying about the atrocities committed against them.
I was elected to the legislature. They offered me $2,500 cash if I would let another man go to the legislature in my place. I told him I would not go back on my people. 65 came to my house. My little daughter came out and begged them not to carry me away. They drew up a gun and threatened her. I may say that they hit me 5,000 blows. Some of them are the first-class men in our town. One is a lawyer, one a doctor, and some are farmers. My little daughter got over it until she died. I have never got over it yet. It broke something inside of me.
The hearings are open and public.
Women showed up at those hearings, and it took a lot of courage for them. They could face
retaliations by the KKK.
But they want the world to know what had been done to them.
All the time I was planting my crop, they worried me about if they ever saw me, they would hurt me.
Whites are really attacking Hannah and her family because they had been too successful. It's jealousy. It flies in the face of the idea that blacks are inferior.
5 men bulged right against the door. George McCrae catched the little child by the foot and slinged it out of my arms. He carried me to a pine, tied my hands there, pulled off all my linen. They said, "God damn you are living on another man's premises." I said, "No, I'm living on my own premises." I gave $150 for it. They whipped me from the crown of my head to the soles of my feet. Every time they would go off, George McCrae would get his knee between my legs, say, "Old lady, if you don't let me have to do with you, I will kill you." He said, "God damn you, I'm gonna kill you."
There are 8,000 pages of testimony given by everyday Americans. This is a haunting tale of American history and something that we don't talk about enough. Violence has always been here and goes side by side in American history to the creation of a white supremacist racial ideology that has driven us from slavery all the way to the present day.
The Union war hero, Ulysses S. Grant, had run for president under the slogan, "Let us have peace." But as reports poured in from the former Confederate states, it was becoming painfully obvious that the terror was not going to stop.
Grant didn't start out as a hero in terms of race relations. At first, he was very dubious about the fighting abilities of blacks, but he ended up becoming one of the greatest champions of recruiting and arming and equipping black soldiers. He had a remarkable record in terms of integrating blacks into the federal government.
Grant's reaction to Klan violence is a strenuous one. He makes it clear to the Speaker of the House that Congress is going to have to address the situation.
Grant was in step with a Congress that was determined to take action.
Congressman Rainey, when he was arguing for protection against the Klan, said that when he and other black congressmen left the seat of government to return home, they were at risk.
There were a couple of incidents where he and others were physically confronted on the road, and only the intervention of federal troops kept things from taking a dire turn. He had absolutely no patience listening to anyone say that maybe the Klan didn't really exist, maybe it wasn't such a big problem. Rainey would say, "I just saw them a couple of days ago. What are you talking about?" And then go on to deliver a very convincing lecture.
Saying that that violence was treasonous and the federal government had an obligation to do something about it.
Congress passed a series of enforcement acts to address the crisis, the third of which is known as the Ku Klux Klan Act.
All of which together were intended to put weapons into the hand of the federal government to directly intervene.
The 14th Amendment established that states could not deprive people of privileges and immunities of citizenship or of due process of law or equal protection of law.
So what Congress is doing in the Enforcement Act, right, is trying to create a new category of offense using the 14th Amendment to, in essence, get around the fact that Southern courts are not going to convict white Southerners.
Most importantly, the federal government can suppress habeas corpus. Where violence occurred, they can hold individuals for a crime without being charged for that crime, and they can also use the militia or the military to go in and suppress violence.
To spearhead the operation, Grant appointed Amos T. Ackerman as Attorney General of the newly created United States Department of Justice, established in the executive branch in 1870.
He supervises the deployment of federal troops to restrain violence.
Many of the Klan members that believe that they're going to be charged by the federal government begin to run away and hide.
Here is the federal government finally finally taking the situation with the Ku Klux Klan in hand and directly striking back at it. The difficulty was going to turn out to be persistence.
The federal government could try to contain the violence, but it couldn't contain the spread of white supremacist ideology manifesting itself in full force.
Southern oligarchs who have held power in the pre-Civil War South for decades did not want to surrender that power.
White supremacy, an alliance between white people against black people, was always an important device that held Southern politics together.
Southern white elites knew how to activate that bond of whiteness with poor Southern whites.
And that was difficult work to do. A lot of propaganda had to go into that.
Planters in the Democratic Party have to sell white supremacy to other white Southerners who might not have the same or even any significant economic stake in white supremacy. That planters play upon racial economic rivalry. The idea that any gain by any black man deprives all white men. So they're creating a racial zero-sum fight for economic power, for government, for jobs, and promising a psychological benefit, a psychological wage of whiteness.
In 1870, when former Confederate General Robert E. Lee died, many white Southerners poured out their grief and sorrow for their fallen hero, a symbol of their so-called lost cause. It seemed that the longer Reconstruction continued, the more the former Confederates lamented the loss of their way of life. Robert E. Lee's death became a symbolic focal point for a wrenching outpouring of nostalgia and grief.
When he died, it's like a king has died.
Bells ring throughout the South.
Schools closed.
People closed their stores.
They wore sashes and put things on their doors to commemorate his passing.
Newspapers border their entire pages with black.
They mourn him as if this is the second time they have lost the war.
In the eyes of the white South, here was a man who embodied the things that they admired the most: manly courage, Christian virtue, devotion to those underneath him, of his soldiers, and a kind of apparent paternalism toward enslaved people. And not only was Lee this perfect person, but he had been the perfect warrior. He had outsmarted the Yankees, but he was always up against larger forces. He helped create that myth at Appomattox that we have succumbed in the face of greater might. Our cause was not unjust, it just happened to have lost. It became a lost cause.
When great leaders die, or when persons die that people think of as great leaders, people are guided by emotion. As a consequence, you have this cult of Robert E. Lee developing.
And in fact, the cult of Lee had become so powerful by the 1870s that Frederick Douglass remarked that you could not pick up a newspaper nowadays without reading the most nauseating flatteries about Robert E. Lee.
The ostentatious and noisy exhibitions of sympathy and grief on the part of the rebel democracy all over the South for the man who made such Herculean efforts to destroy the government is a most painful proof that the great body of the Southern white people are far more ready to weep for the loss of a Confederate general than to sustain the government under which they live.
Douglass recognized if you rewrite the story of the war, that can have profound implications for race relations. The symbolism of Lee could become very dangerous.
The clock was ticking on Reconstruction, and the presidential race of 1872 was a test of its popularity. With black voters solidly in this corner, President Grant easily won re-election. But the campaign revealed growing fault lines in the Republican Party.
Grant faced a renegade liberal Republican movement that was critical of the mainstream of the Republican Party.
Their good government types were very upset by the scandals that had been exposed in the Grant administration.
Credit Mobilier was basically a phony company that was set up to provide financing for the Pacific Railroad project, and it laundered money. It made lots of money for corrupt individuals. The difficulty is that those corrupt individuals were often members of Congress.
Grant was personally quite honest, but he seemed blind, credulous, almost childlike to the presence of unscrupulous people.
Corruption is as American as apple pie. And if we find it in the Grant administration and the Reconstruction South, that's not because Reconstruction was inherently corrupt. It's because corruption happens. You could almost make a bumper sticker out of it.
Liberal Republicans are also adopting more of a states' rights position now. We can't just keep intervening in the South, and nominated their own candidate for president, Horace Greeley, the editor of the New York Tribune, a long-standing anti-slavery advocate.
Greeley made this famous statement that he's confident that masses of our citizens, North and South, are eager to clasp hands across the bloody chasm that divides them.
The split in the Republican Party is the harbinger of a retreat from Reconstruction.
Support for Reconstruction was waning in the North, where many had grown weary from the growing cost of peace. In this environment, black legislators became targets of scorn, ridicule, and anti-black racist propaganda.
Derogatory images of African Americans become more and more prominent in the 1870s.
Even someone like Thomas Nast, who was a very vocal advocate for African American political rights during Reconstruction, used his artistry with Harper's Weekly to depict the African Americans in South Carolina, for example, where they have a black majority, in the most vile ways.
James Pike, a Republican, works on the New York Tribune, publishes this book called The Prostrate State. South Carolina is under the rule of barbarism, incompetence.
He has a famous passage in which he's describing really buffoons. Those who are not buffoons are corrupt or incompetent.
He hammers again and again and again on almost animalistic stereotypes of field workers to say, really? Are these the people you want to have in charge of your government? Passing laws that suck tax dollars out of hardworking Americans? No. And in fact, we're pretty sure they shouldn't be parts of polite American society at all.
They perpetuate an idea that Reconstruction has effectively failed and that the federal government and the Republican Party needed to cut its losses and remove itself from the South. Leave the Negro to those who know him best. White Southerners.
As enthusiasm for Reconstruction dwindled in the North, Democrats felt emboldened to intensify their counter-revolution throughout the South. Year after year, election after election, they would not relent. In 1873, amidst the fallout from a fiercely contested election in Louisiana, black Republicans in the town of Colfax staged an armed occupation of the courthouse to prevent Democrats from taking over the Perry seat.
White paramilitary organizations surround the courthouse with artillery.
The white vigilantes offered guarantees of safe conduct. If you will come out, if you will surrender yourselves, the white vigilantes line them up and execute them. It's nothing more than pure, unadulterated murder. The United States Attorney in Louisiana, under the Enforcement Acts, is responsible for the arrest of over 100 of the white vigilantes. However, Louisiana juries turned out to be extraordinarily reluctant to convict. Only 3 convictions are obtained.
White Southerners made it difficult for the Republicans and Northerners to enforce Reconstruction policy. The organized white supremacist groups were trying to make the cost of federal intervention higher than the federal government was willing to bear.
In state after state, increasingly organized societies, paramilitary clubs, white leagues claimed control of public places.
John Roy Lynch, now a congressman, was targeted when he returned home to Mississippi to campaign.
At Fayette, they paraded the streets, yelled, fired cannon. Each club had a wagon with fodder. Colored men said these wagons contained guns. Democrats had all gathered around the place. I took the stand. They commenced to yell at the top of their voices so as to drown out every word I attempted to utter.
Southern whites were attempting to take the South back. The red shirts and the Knights of the White Camellia. That's essentially what the so-called redemption movements were.
They are the ones who are defending the right order of things in civilization, that white people control black people. And that's the way it should be.
The brutal violence was accompanied by a major economic downturn, the first since the end of the war. It was known as the Panic. Banks and railroads were at the center of the storm, but soon it spread to every corner of the economy.
The Panic of 1873 has enormously destructive influences through the economy, North and South. A really devastating impact is political.
Northern Republicans lose election after election in the midterms of 1874 to Democrats who promised first to save the economy, but also to end Reconstruction in the South.
Democrats achieve a majority in the House of Representatives for the first time since the Civil War.
Democrats also gained control of state governments in Alabama, Texas, and Arkansas. Reconstruction's future was perilous. But the fight wasn't over. In 1874, congressional districts with majority black populations elected leaders like Robert Smalls and John Lynch. They would face stiff opposition as members of the minority party.
The Democratic majority in the House of Representatives means no more money for Reconstruction initiatives. So, if there will be political troubles around election time, if the Ku Klux Klan will suddenly reawaken and begin intimidating voters at the polls, murdering black people on the roads, night riding to terrorize blacks into submission, there will be no initiative coming out of Washington.
Was there a sense of desperation because of the reversal of the 1874 election?
What had been a 100-seat majority for Republicans turned into roughly an 80-seat majority for Democrats. Coming into the new Congress, we had a long lame duck session of about 3 months. The clock is ticking. African Americans know that this is really probably going to be the last shot at a far-reaching civil rights bill.
It prohibited discrimination in public transportation, juries, public accommodations such as hotels, and public education. Immediately when the Civil Rights Bill came to the floor, Southern Democrats and Northern Democrats alike railed against the bill. They believed that it was unconstitutional.
Opponents of the bill thought the U.S. government had no business telling the proprietors of restaurants or the people who run railroads who they could admit. These are private businesses, and they can decide who their clientele is.
The critics believed that it was not about non-discrimination. They saw it as about social equality. And their view is that social equality could not be legislated. It couldn't be enforced. It shouldn't be imposed.
This is pushing integration that is unnatural.
You're going to force a white person to ride next to a black person, and the next thing you know, you're going to force a white person to have a black person over for dinner, or interracial marriage.
So they were apoplectic about the idea that they had to protect their whiteness, and in particular, protect their white women against this exposure to African Americans.
Near the end of the first full day of debate, most members were given 20 minutes each to speak. And Alexander Stephens of Georgia, former Confederate vice president, stood up feebly because he was confined to a wheelchair and requested a full hour to speak. And Republican leadership agreed as long as Robert Brown Elliott also had a full hour to provide his rebuttal. Stephens, leaning precariously on a big stack of papers, gives this long, monotone, prepared speech in which he goes over the unconstitutional arguments for the Civil Rights Bill. When he sits down, it's late. George Hoare of Massachusetts says, well, you know what, maybe we won't have Elliott speak today. Maybe he can go first thing tomorrow. And that may have been strategic, because word got out that Robert Elliott was going to provide the rebuttal to the former vice president of the Confederacy. The next day when Elliott takes the floor, the galleries are packed with African American observers. Reporters had shown up, and the whole chamber is just filled with people. Elliott gives this really booming delivery.
The Constitution of a free government ought always be construed in favor of human rights. I cannot and I will not forget that the welfare and rights of my whole race in this country are involved. The race whom he spurned and trampled on are here to meet him in debate and to demand the rights which are enjoyed by their former oppressors.
When Elliott finishes, the whole room erupts into booming applause. People line up to shake his hand. This is a real symbolic moment. The old planter class appears feeble and on its way out, and this dark-skinned, suave, intelligent African-American man represented the way forward.
Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, but there was a clause that was stripped from the final act, and that was about education. Americans were not ready for that kind of equality in education yet, and apparently wouldn't be for many, many more years.
While Congress managed to get the Civil Rights Act of 1875 across the finish line, another branch of government blunted the reach of the 14th Amendment. In 1876, the Supreme Court announced its ruling in United States versus Cruikshank, the appeal of the 3 white men convicted of murdering African Americans guarding the courthouse in Colfax, Louisiana.
The decision which is handed down in Cruikshank is one of the most remarkably feeble-minded and disastrous decisions that a United States Supreme Court has ever handed down. And the reasoning ran like this. The 14th Amendment was only intended to restrain states from depriving U.S. citizens of the privileges and immunities that they're supposed to enjoy. But what went on in the Colfax Massacre, first of all, was not a state action. It was not the state of Louisiana. But this was, in fact, merely individuals.
It was a local crime. Private violence is the business of the states. And if they are not taking care of it, that's just too bad.
Mobs of whites decide to kill you. Have you been denied your right? Well, the Supreme Court decided that you've not been denied your right if you were murdered, as long as it's just private individuals, whether individually or collectively, that are interfering with your rights. That's not a federal case.
While the Cruikshank decision didn't close the door on possible future prosecutions, it narrowed the pathways for enforcing the 14th Amendment.
Little stood between the Redeemers and their ultimate goal, which was terrorize African Americans so completely that across the South, hundreds of thousands who had been registered and had been politically active would be reduced to a few hundreds in many of the jurisdictions that they once actually dominated.
Grant saw that support for Reconstruction was eroding. So he decided to pull back on military interventions in the South to enhance his party's chances in the North. With the next presidential election months away, Washingtonians, black and white, came together to honor a past president, Abraham Lincoln. For one man, the occasion afforded an unprecedented national platform for a call to action.
On April 14, 1876, this plaza near Capitol Hill was teeming with people, including members of both houses of Congress, the Supreme Court justices, and the President of the United States, Ulysses S. Grant. The crowd had gathered here on the 11th anniversary of Lincoln's assassination to witness the unveiling of this monument honoring his crowning achievement, the Emancipation Proclamation.
The most memorable words spoken that day were those of Frederick Douglass.
Truth compels me to admit, even here in the presence of the monument, Abraham Lincoln was not our man. He was preeminently the white man's president. You are the children of Abraham Lincoln. We are best his stepchildren. To you, it especially belongs to preserve and perpetuate his memory and commend his example.
When he says Abraham Lincoln was a white man's president, you go, whoa, that is an amazing thing to say in front of the most powerful politicians in the Republic in the year 1876. It's shocking.
Yeah, it's a presidential election year. It appears that Reconstruction is unraveling. He used this opportunity to make a speech about the responsibility of the U.S. government, which was sitting right in front of him, to hold together whatever was left of Reconstruction if they could.
There's this understanding in 1876 that blacks have all the rights now that they should expect. We have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The Republican Party, it's become a party of large financiers, corporate men, and captains of industry. Now let's focus on the economy.
When Republicans cast around for a likely candidate, Rutherford B. Hayes seems to be the man. He finished the war as a Union general. But by the time he becomes governor of Ohio, he has begun to pull back on black equality. He's untainted by corruption, which will be extremely valuable because Samuel Tilden is running almost entirely on an anti-corruption platform as a Democrat. But Hayes is also bland enough that he will offer no objection to anyone. He is a first-rate, second-rate man.
Both candidates pledged that they would bring Reconstruction to an end.
Election night is complete and utter confusion.
Even though Tilden won the popular vote, the results from Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana, where African Americans faced severe violent repression, were undetermined.
Republicans convinced Southern governments to declare enough votes invalid to swing the Electoral College to Hayes.
The Democrats were so outraged by the fact that Tilden was not declared the winner that they began to rally their voters under the slogan "Tilden or Blood." There were real fears of civil war. Grant started to call in troops to guard Washington. And he said, either party can afford to lose an election, but we as a people cannot afford to have a presidential election that is tainted by false or illegal results. Congress created a bipartisan commission that declared Hayes the winner by one vote.
Democrats predictably cried foul.
Hayes was referred to as Rutherford B. Hayes. He was called his fraudulency.
February, as Inauguration Day neared, the election still remained undecided. Republicans and Democrats came together and cut a deal. Hayes was inaugurated as President of the United States.
It's hard to imagine, in the moment of an election, a party trading a presidential victory, unless it means protecting their way of life. White supremacy is a long-term campaign. It was more important to reinstate that power structure than it was to win the White House.
Hayes promises white Southerners that he will leave the South to conduct its own affairs.
Children, Black people were going to suffer because Northerners had decided to move on.
It was a time of so much hope and so much optimism. The horizon seemed limitless. And then, boom, came redemption.
I can only imagine it was the most frustrating thing for Robert Smalls. Here's someone who literally risked his life to be free and devoted himself to creating this new America. And to see that dismantle must have just been horrible. You know, one of his most famous quotes is, "My race needs no special defense, for the past history of them in this country proves them to be the equal of anyone, anywhere. All they need is an equal shot at the battle of life."
From the very beginning, the success of Reconstruction depended on the will of the nation to hold the line against the forces of violence eager to undo it. As the nation's will faltered, the rights of African Americans would be sacrificed to political expediency. After 12 tumultuous years, Black people faced an uncertain future. As Frederick Douglass put it, if war among the whites brought peace and liberty to Blacks, what will peace among the whites bring?
Support from viewers like you makes this program possible. Please give to your PBS station.
On the evening of June 17, 2015, a stranger walked into an historic Black church in Charleston, South Carolina, known as Mother Emanuel. He prayed with the Wednesday night Bible study group for almost an hour. Then, he opened fire.
We have 9 victims, and I do believe this was a hate crime.
Friends say the 21-year-old high school dropout was a loner, an unabashed racist with a deep hatred for Black people.
He just said, "I have to do it." He said, "You rape our women and you taking over our country."
The massacre in Charleston touched off not only a debate over the Confederate flag, but it touched off a debate all over the country. How did we get here? And why is this happening?
It was easy, I guess, to think of that as a singular horror. And it was convenient, I think, to think of it that way. Unless you really wanted to understand how this could happen. And then that meant that you had to get into the history.
Most of us know that our country fought a civil war in the 1860s. But less is known about what came afterward, the chaotic, exhilarating, and ultimately devastating period known as Reconstruction.
If we're looking for the roots of the tragedy at Mother Emanuel, this is where we have to start.
The Reconstruction period is one of extraordinary excitement, a time when America could finally become that land of freedom that it had promised to be since the very beginning.
Black people actually sat in the House of Representatives and the Senate. Poor whites and Black people saw a common cause with one another.
You're seeing this opportunity and imagining that will only get better. And looking back, what we know is those Black folks had no idea of the cliff that they were heading towards.
The achievements of Reconstruction triggered a fearsome backlash, an onslaught of terror and oppression that lasted for decades.
After 250 years of slavery, white Southerners could not quite accept the 4 million former slaves as equal members of their society.
Violence is used in conjunction with Jim Crow in order to strip African Americans of the rights and privileges they gained during Reconstruction. The Charleston Massacre comes from a long history of white terror against African Americans.
But Reconstruction left a legacy of hope, as well as violence.
We have to recognize the injustices that were inflicted, but we can't reduce all history to that injustice. People who had been held in perpetual bondage confronted the greatest sin of American history straight on.
Their hopes were far greater than maybe what any government can accomplish. A system functioning without race being a barrier to equality. We still haven't quite gotten there.
Almost a century and a half later, we still find ourselves haunted by the collapse of Reconstruction, a chapter of our history that's often been misrepresented and misunderstood. It's time that we acknowledge the true story and complete the work of reconstructing America. When I was in high school, Black history consisted of a few simple facts and a very happy ending. Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. But this was the 1960s. 100 years after emancipation, Black people were fighting for the most basic rights. So what happened to that happy ending? It turns out that wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. April 9th, 1865, Palm Sunday. At the village of Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to United States Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant. Lee's capitulation effectively signaled the end of the Civil War and the death of slavery in the United States. The news rippled out from Appomattox.
A strange woman I never seen before came running down where we were all at work. She said as loud as she could, "Hey, freedom, you are free." Everybody was getting up his clothes and leaving. They didn't know where they was going, just scattering around.
It was just like opening a door and letting the bird fly out. He might starve or freeze or be killed pretty soon, but he just felt good because he was free.
To a remarkable degree, it was the slaves themselves who had helped bring this to pass. From the war's first days, legions of enslaved people defied their masters and fled to Union lines. Others were liberated by the United States Army as it occupied parts of the South. By the summer of 1862, many thousands of slaves had found safe haven. Their brave actions, as much as any other factor, converted President Lincoln and many other Americans to emancipation. When Black men were finally allowed to enlist in the Union Army, 180,000 answered the call, most of them former slaves.
It was both the manpower that they brought to the Union side and also the denial of their manpower in the production of the Southern economy.
There's no question that they strengthened the Union hand militarily, and they changed the nature of what a military victory would mean.
The role of Black soldiers, Lincoln said this himself, was essential in ensuring that the war would end with the abolition of slavery.
What would the future hold for these freed people? Now untethered, their status as citizens was very much in question, with few legal rights or protections guaranteed. Even so, the prayers of generations were being answered. As Lee and Grant negotiated the terms of surrender, the government in Washington was wrestling with what was being called Reconstruction. On the surface, Reconstruction just meant restoring the rebel states to the Union. In fact, it raised a host of questions.
Reconstruction is the process by which American society, North, South, Black, white, tried to come to terms with the consequences of the Civil War, the reunion of the nation, the destruction of slavery, the question of what the status of the 4 million former slaves would be as free people in American life.
One of the first questions that the post-war period has to confront is who is a citizen, and then what rights attend to citizenship? Who are former slaves going to be in the body politic?
In parts of the South that the Army liberated during the war, officials have been confronted with issues like education, land ownership, and workers' rights. Even at Appomattox, it was apparent that the North and the South saw Reconstruction quite differently.
Grant goes into these negotiations thinking, well, we won, not just militarily, but our principles won. Robert E. Lee comes into it thinking, it shows that you had more men and more cannon than we did. We acknowledge no wrong. And they just talk right past each other, which is one reason it becomes not the end of all this struggle, but in some ways the beginning.
These ideas start to accumulate around Appomattox of a merciful coming together of peace. Many iconic images associate this surrender ceremony with Jesus entering the city of Jerusalem, the city of peace. But they don't actually help us understand what happened there at all. Whatever Appomattox is, it's not the start of peace.
2 days after Appomattox, Abraham Lincoln spoke about Reconstruction at the White House. For the first time in public, the president suggested that some black men, the very intelligent, and black veterans deserve the right to vote. A man in the audience turned to his companion and said, "That is the last speech he will ever make." On April 14th, 1865, Good Friday, John Wilkes Booth made good on his threat. The reckoning for America's original sin was just beginning. The early days of freedom were a bewildering mixture of exhilaration and apprehension. But the first order of business was to reconnect with family members who had been torn away by slavery.
Information wanted. I had 2 children sold for me about 10 years ago by a man by the name of Pate. My boy's name was Monroe Early, and my daughter's name, Mary Early.
Starting in 1865, so shortly after the end of the war, you see people placing ads in newspapers. It really gives a sense of the separation that had occurred during slavery.
Information wanted. Of my father, Jerry Hodges of Norfolk County, Virginia. I was sold from him when I was a small girl about 30 years ago. My mother's name was Phoebe, and she belonged to a man named Ashcroft.
This moment of emancipation is a serious moment of upheaval. A lot of people are moving about. There are a lot of things that are going on. But for African Americans, one of their big things is to try to build the lives that they've been thinking about while they're enslaved.
People took to the roads trying to find family members. I mean, literally walking to where they had last left family.
Information wanted of my children, Louis, Lizzie, and Kate Mason, whom I last saw in Owensboro, Kentucky. They were then owned by David and John Hart, that is, the girls were. But the boy was rather the property of Thomas Pointer.
Imagine keeping this memory of your child or your wife or your husband, your father, your mother, alive in your mind and in your heart, and then trying to bring about some kind of reunification. But you hardly know where to start.
The end of the Civil War
brought more questions than answers. Even the status of slavery was unresolved. The 13th Amendment passed Congress in January, but it hadn't been ratified by the states. And what did freedom mean? Could the freed people be citizens? Were they entitled to a role in politics? Could they earn wages in the free market? It was a dangerous time that would have tested the abilities of even the greatest president.
Just hours after Lincoln's death, Andrew Johnson was sworn in at a hotel on Pennsylvania Avenue. When Lincoln chose a Southern Unionist Democrat as his running mate in 1864, few imagined that Johnson would ever ascend to the presidency.
During Reconstruction, the Republican Party is the party of civil rights. It is the party that promotes a vision of an interracial democracy. The Republican Party is the party of African Americans.
Although Johnson was a Southerner and a Democrat, he had opposed secession, even at the risk of his life.
Andrew Johnson grew up a poor white Southerner. He believed very strongly that the Civil War had been caused by the planter class, the Southern elite, and he hated them. But he imagined that the primary victim of the planter class was the class to which he belonged, the poor whites of the South.
Andrew Johnson was the first man in this country made president by an assassin's bullet. He wouldn't be shy about using his newly gained power.
Congress had gavelled out of session in March. They're not coming back till December. Out of session, they're stuck, and Johnson is in the driver's seat.
The most famous black man in America, the abolitionist Frederick Douglass, had his doubts about the new president.
At Lincoln's second inaugural, Johnson meets with Frederick Douglass. When Johnson realizes that he has to shake a black man's hand, his smile turns into a scowl. Douglass smells the liquor on his breath. He's already drunk at 11 a.m. Douglass says to his friend, no matter what else Andrew Johnson is, he is no friend of the black.
Even as the freed people celebrated the death of
education and the right to earn a living, for many, the basis of being truly free was the right to own land.
In the summer of 1865, the question of land was very much on the mind of Major General Oliver Howard. That May, Howard had been given one of the most daunting assignments in American history. As the head of a new government agency, the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, Howard was given a few hundred agents and then charged with overseeing the entire transition of Southern society from slavery to freedom.
The Freedmen's Bureau was supposed to protect blacks from violence. It was supposed to give them access to education. It was supposed to, in some way, get them access to land. It was supposed to make sure that local courts treated blacks fairly. White Southerners deeply resented the Freedmen's Bureau, even though they were not there to quite protect the former slaves, as to make sure that relations between white and black were fair and equitable on both sides.
The federal government never done anything like this. The budget of the Freedmen's Bureau on an annual basis was not much more than what it cost to fight the Civil War for 1 week.
Though having limited resources, what the Freedmen's Bureau had plenty of was land. Over 850,000 acres of it. And Howard sensibly wanted the freedmen to have use of it.
During the Civil War, a lot of land came into the hands of the federal government. Some of it was seized for non-payment of taxes. Some of it was just abandoned by planters who fled when the Union Army appeared. The Freedmen's Bureau was to oversee this land.
At the end of July, General Howard ordered his agents to begin renting out 40-acre plots. The freedmen would have 3 years to buy the land outright.
course, this phrase, 40 acres and a mule, was picked up by African Americans all around the South. Many people thought this is a blueprint for Reconstruction.
But within weeks, Howard's plans were in trouble.
Johnson's Reconstruction plan, which he put forward in May of 1865, basically gave amnesty to most white Southerners who would take an oath to the Union and also accept the end of slavery. But he said those who owned $20,000 worth of property before the war are not going to be covered by a blanket pardon. They have to come and get an individual pardon from the president.
Johnson also began setting up new state governments in the former Confederacy.
President Johnson had a very soft version of Reconstruction, almost like a restoration of the Southern states.
White Southerners have to accept the fact that slavery is dead. But other than that, Johnson was giving them a free hand in keeping the black population under control.
Many Republicans worried that Johnson was undermining the result of the war, but there wasn't much they could do because Congress was in recess.
Johnson felt that he could handle Reconstruction perfectly well, all be done by the time Congress came back into session in December 1865.
In May, Andrew Johnson decreed that wealthy rebels would only be pardoned if they appealed in person to him. All through the summer of 1865, a steady stream of prominent Southerners, the very people Johnson loathed, called at the White House to beg the president's forgiveness.
This was a poor boy who was not recognized among the elite class when he was in Tennessee. People that he had hated are now coming to him and asking for pardons, and he liked it.
By the end of the summer of 1865, many of the former Confederates who took the South out of the Union have received presidential pardons, which means they are back in American society. They could vote. They get to make whatever laws they want. And there's nothing you can do about that.
In September, Johnson ordered Howard to restore almost all of the lands in the hands of the Freedmen's Bureau back to the Confederates he had pardoned.
It fell to Oliver Howard to go and inform free people that they were probably going to have to start entering into labor contracts with, in many cases, their former owners.
Howard knew he had to deliver this devastating news in person, in places like Edisto Island on the South Carolina coast.
They could not believe it, and so they refused to leave. The freed people start shouting, "No, no," and then an old woman starts singing, "Nobody knows the troubles I've seen." And everyone in this church starts singing that song. And Howard is just devastated.
The Edisto Islanders desperately appealed directly to the president.
We were the only true and loyal people that were found in possession of these lands. We have always been ready to fight if needs be to preserve this glorious union. Will a good and just government take from us all this right and make us subject to the will of those who have cheated and oppressed us? We look to you in this trying hour as a true friend of the poor and neglected race.
Their plea went unanswered.
The United States had the opportunity at that time to make amends for centuries of enslavement. The United States had the opportunity to make it possible for the formerly enslaved people to be economically independent. And the country failed to do it. By not redistributing that land, it consigned most of them to a dependence that remained for decades afterwards. And we're still dealing with the fallout from that.
How'd you get involved with this, the planning of this monument?
More perhaps than anyone else, historian Eric Foner has brought the truth about Reconstruction to light. We visited the newly dedicated Reconstruction-era National Monument in Beaufort, South Carolina.
This area was almost like a a test case. Could these former slaves really be free people? Could they learn? Could they work as free people? Not everybody knew what the answer was going to be, but they proved themselves in Beaufort, and it actually therefore had an impact on Reconstruction as it developed.
You've written what many of us think is the Bible on Reconstruction. You've written 10 books on Reconstruction. You're going to write an 11th on the Reconstruction amendments. To what do we attribute your fascination?
You know, the ferment at the local level in Reconstruction, which really I think is the big story, how the end of slavery upends everything. And a new system has to be created, a new economic system, a new political system, a new legal system. You know, slavery was a total institution. When that's gone, you got to build a new society.
And one of the barriers, of course, was the tremendous legacy of anti-Black racism.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. Racism, which is the deepest legacy of slavery, really, in our society, you know, it would be nice, but one can't very well expect that the legacy of racism would just be sloughed off because slavery ended. Didn't happen, and that was a tremendous barrier to change.
In 1866, a Richmond journalist published a book called The Lost Cause. He argued that the war was, in reality, a gracious Southern civilization defending itself against Northern aggression, an idea that resonated deeply among the defeated white Southerners.
One has to remember that the white South suffered a devastating loss of life in the Civil War, something really without parallel in American history.
The South is devastated. People are literally starving. They had destroyed their economy. They had torn their families apart. It was hard to see real meaning in what the Confederacy had done. I think people wanted to find something to hang on to.
Many former Confederates stubbornly clung to the belief that their cause had been just.
That whole lost cause myth developed out of the idea that the only reason why they were fighting at all was because the North was trying to suppress their rights. For the Confederacy, the war was absolutely about slavery. First, last, middle. All we have to do is look at the ordinances of secession, the debates in the various state legislatures, private letters. They're all talking about slavery as the cornerstone of their civilization.
The Confederate Constitution was very, very clear in terms of the role of slavery in its society. Number one, that it shall in fact be perpetual. And number two, if the nation expands, slavery goes with it.
Looking back almost a century later, a Southern writer noted, only at the moment when Lee handed Grant his sword was the Confederacy born.
One of the things that's often forgotten is that many white Southerners did not want to fight for the Confederacy, had never supported secession in the first place. But with the end of the war, it becomes possible to imagine a kind of unified Confederacy as it recedes.
The Confederacy, in many ways, has had far more of an active life after Appomattox than it did before. After Appomattox, it was just a fantasy. It was a dream of what that nation could have been.
Some people coped with defeat by mythologizing slavery. Others tried to recreate it. In November of 1865, the government that Andrew Johnson had set up in Mississippi passed a set of oppressive laws that applied only to African Americans. Soon, other Southern states followed suit. These laws became known as the Black Codes.
The basic purpose of the Black Codes was to recognize that slavery has been abolished, but to make sure that there is as little change from slavery to freedom as possible.
The key to the Black Codes was what they called vagrancy laws, things like that. Every adult Black person was required to sign a labor contract for the year with a white employer. If they didn't do that, they would be considered a vagrant, and they could be fined, and if they couldn't pay the fine, they could be auctioned off to someone who would pay the fine, and then they'd have to work off the fine for that person.
What's even worse than being arrested if you don't have a job is having your children taken away. So your neighbor down the road can go to the courts and say, John Jones, he can't take care of his children. He's indigent, but I'll take them in. And I will train them in farming methods, or I'll train the daughters in housewifery. And I will have them get a little bit of money at the end of their period of indenture. But Black parents didn't have a say in this.
A lot of parents are fighting back and saying, no, they don't want their children to be apprenticed. They can take care of them. They also know that in apprenticeship conditions, they can't protect their children from physical and sexual abuse. It becomes a way for the planter class to continue stealing the labor of the children and sometimes stealing the children themselves.
Enforcement of the Black Codes went hand in hand with relentless violence against the freed people.
Outside of cities and towns, the Union Army was shrinking rather than expanding. You're looking at former slaveholders who can't imagine living in a world where slavery doesn't exist if the Union Army is not on the ground and the Freedmen's Bureau is not there to enforce the new rules. Then they were going to do whatever they could to keep the African American population in a state of subordination.
The Ku Klux Klan is created in Tennessee in 1866. It coincides with the creation of Black Codes. You could argue that on some levels that the Klan is doing the same thing that the slave patrols did. During slavery, the slave patrols would make sure people have passes, making sure that they are not loitering. They're not getting together in bands of people. And the Klan is going to do the same type of thing.
You have people who are targeted because they've managed to acquire a decent amount of land, or their children are in school and a white person in their community is struggling at the same time. What they decide is that the way to deal with this is to attack the person, to take away everything they have, to destroy their property, to run them off their land.
At war's end, Frederick Douglass had wondered what new form slavery might take. After 6 months of Andrew Johnson's Reconstruction, the answer was painfully obvious. Thaddeus Stevens, the passionately impatient Republican congressman, had been forced to wait on the sidelines for months, watching powerlessly as Andrew Johnson raced to implement his version of Reconstruction before Congress reconvened. The president declared that the former Confederate states had met his terms, so their representatives were in Washington, ready to take their seats in Congress as members of the Union once again. Stevens thought this was outrageous.
When the states met to elect new congressional delegations, they elected to Congress the Vice President of the Confederacy, 4 Confederate generals, 6 members of the Confederate cabinet, many Confederate congressmen.
It is, by its very nature, defiant for Southern white former Confederate officers to head to Congress right after the war. On the other hand, they never believed the war was about fundamentally restructuring their economic and political hierarchy. The idea that if you served or if you had slaves at one point, that now you are politically disenfranchised never was in the kind of Southern white imagination during that period of time.
Once the Southern delegates were seated in Congress, they'd represent their home states back in the Union again.
Either they were going to be admitted And that was going to be the end. And Reconstruction would have been over at that point, or they weren't.
As a leader of the House Republicans, Stevens found the prospect appalling.
Thaddeus Stevens would say, African American men helped save the United States. We have a moral obligation to create a foundation of freedom and equality before the law. And without that, anything else is going to be a fraud. He was fired with this passion for justice that would saturate the entire social order. He was ready for a revolution in the South.
Stevens and his fellow House Republicans had planned for this moment. At the stroke of noon, when the 39th Congress opened, they set those plans in motion.
The clerk began to read the roll of the members of Congress, and he skipped over the representatives from the southern states.
As it becomes clear that they're not going to call upon any rebel state congressman, Democrats start to jump up and to scream, "This is revolution." In fact, they were right. It was a revolution.
Each House of Congress has the power to exclude those it finds unfit. If the clerk fails to call your name, you're not a member of Congress. Not a single name from the rebel states did the clerk call that day. Congress was boldly seizing control of Reconstruction.
Some Democrats say the American Republic died on December 4th, 1865, and in some ways they might be right. But a second American Republic is born over the next 5 years that has a different constitution, one that's going to be written painfully and slowly and imperfectly, but written by Stevens and his colleagues in Congress.
This Republican-dominated Congress turned its attention to a pioneering Civil Rights Act, which they passed over President Johnson's veto in April 1866.
It was Congress's answer, you might say, to the Black Codes and to Johnson's Reconstruction Plan. It established the principle of birthright citizenship. Anyone born in the country is a citizen.
Why do they do this? Because they know that southern states are looking for ways to define ex-slaves as not citizens.
Part of what the Civil Rights Act of 1866 is doing is pushing away the prospect that people can be, as had been true for Native Americans, that people can be physically removed from the nation.
While Republicans were gaining the upper hand in Washington, a more brutal struggle was being waged throughout the South.
The white South begins to realize that there's no real possibility of fighting the North, but they can win the struggle on the ground, at home, over the people that they're really worried about.
All throughout the South, Black people were on the move, leaving the countryside for the city. But as the crowding grew worse, tensions mounted.
Where do you live?
I've lived in Memphis very nearly 3 years.
How old are you?
I don't know exactly. I suppose about 24.
Were you here during the riots?
Yes, sir.
Afternoon of May 1st, 1866, the streets of South Memphis were even busier than usual. The city was packed with freed people. Memphis had been garrisoned by a Black regiment, and a Freedmen's Bureau office had opened there. Late that afternoon, Lucy Tibbs heard gunfire in the distance. The city's Black garrison was being demobilized, and many of the former soldiers were celebrating in the streets. Memphis was seething with racial hostility, especially between the largely Irish police force and the Black garrison.
African American Civil War veterans return, not only with a kind of bearing that